security standards.
New regulation.
Cyber demands our attention at a global level.
Welcome to Cybos Toronto. I'm happy to see you all this afternoon and very excited to get into our first big issue debate. I'm Craig Young, Chief Technology Officer for Swift, and it's my pleasure to introduce today's discussion on cybersecurity and digitization. As digitalization is being embraced by companies, communities, cities, organizations large and small, an increasing number of interactions and business processes are taking place online. Cybersecurity is one of the biggest challenges that will come with this evolution. Our world is becoming more and more digitized, providing tremendous opportunities to legitimate users, but also creating a new dimension for malicious forces to attack. Today's discussion with a distinguished team of experts will be moderated by James Kaplan. He is leading McKinsey's global capabilities in global IT infrastructure and cybersecurity. And before handing over to James, I am honored to introduce our keynote speaker. She graduated from the United States Naval Academy in 1982 and from the Army's Command and General Staff College in 1998 with a Master's of Military Arts and Sciences. Her 35-year naval career is marked with firsts. She made history as the first African-American woman to captain a U.S. naval ship in 1999. And in 2014, she was the first woman promoted to the rank of 4-star admiral in the U.S. Navy. Her rise in ranks is astonishing, and since June 2016, she has commanded naval forces in Europe and Africa. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Admiral Michelle Howard. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Jim. Well, thank you. I don't know if I'll be as entertaining as that first slide show, so I just use old-fashioned PowerPoint slides, if you'll forgive me. First of all, Cybos, thank you for allowing me to talk on one of my favorite topics, which is the cyber domain, cybersecurity. And several years ago, when I became the second in command of a fleet on the East Coast, I realized I needed to start talking to our commanders about this. I needed to figure out where they were in the cyber domain, what their understanding was, and what their obligations were as a leader. So I developed this talk, which I found actually works well with anyone who's in a leadership position. And so I'd like to share it with you today, and then perhaps we can ask a few questions about it as we move into the panel piece. But for me, if you really want to understand the obligations of leadership, cyber, and change, you got to start a long time ago. First slide. So this is a picture up in the corner. A beautiful old suit is Chester Nimitz, who in World War II would grow up to be one of our phenomenal leaders. He would lead the Pacific Battle in World War II, eventually as a 5-star admiral. But this is Chester Nimitz decades before that. This is him in 1905, when he's a midshipman getting ready to graduate. Well, what that means is Chester Nimitz was born in 1885. And you think about how different the world was from 1885 to 1905. And let me just give you one example. So he grows up in the West, working with cattle and riding horses before the invention of the telephone. But then in the finance industry, there's this guy, Edward Callahan, who in 1861, long before Chester Nimitz was born, goes to work for Western Union in New York. And he sees all these messengers running around between the stock market and business, and he says, well, that's inefficient. And so he invents an electronic way to transmit messages. That becomes the ticker tape, advanced by Thomas Edison, and it's such a great technological change, it is rapidly incorporated to the way the stock market works. It was kept moving forward until the one time, the black market in 1929, it was basically overcome. So much was going on. So the ticker tape was around when Chester Nimitz was a teenager. But you think back to 1905. The reason that photograph and that of someone at a ticker tape are in black and white is because in 1905, color photography hadn't been invented. In 1905, there were no automobiles. In 1905, there was no pop-up toaster. In 1905, the zipper hadn't been invented. Can you imagine as an adult trying to learn how to use a zipper? In 1905, flight had just happened. Kitty Hawk was in 1903. Chester Nimitz is already in college, and this marvelous new world has been born. Now, as he's coming into his adulthood, this is what the Navy looks like in 1905 and 1906. Big battleships, coal burners, big guns, big weapons. And I think that as a midshipman in Annapolis, Maryland, walking around, he would not think about that someday someone would take an airplane and put it on a ship. That was his future. Next slide. No, in fact, Chester Nimitz grows up in a Navy that focused on big ships at sea. And our way to dominate, we thought warfare would be about a large ship with large guns, with large munitions and large reach, all within a single plane. And as he grew up in the Navy, the size of the ships and the size of the guns just got bigger and bigger. Well, then just before the start of World War I, the air power started to come into its own. We have pilots who moved to support the European theater. We have folks like Billy Mitchell who start aviation expeditionary squadrons. And they realize we can put these aircraft in the air and we can help spot the enemy. So the Navy thought, wow, we could put a flat top on a ship, we could have an aircraft fly off, and then that aircraft could spot enemy ships, and then we would know where to go to fight. Well, during World War I, the aviators themselves said, you know, there's more that we can do. If you put a small bomb in the aircraft, we can actually not just point out where the enemy is, we can actually become a striking arm of the military. So all of this warfighting development happened, a lot of it in World War I. And it didn't reach its sort of professional maturity at that point. In fact, after World War I, there was a huge debate led by Billy Mitchell himself, who was a brigadier general in the Army at the time. And he started to push this idea of air power, of being able to strike from the air, which in the end, from his perspective, might have made ships and armies outdated. He got to the point where, with the Navy, he did demonstrations and showed he could sink a ship off of Norfolk just by dropping bombs out of aircraft. And that scared a lot of people. It was something new and different. And then he probably went a little bit too far, and he actually started to publicly impugn his colleagues and say, these old admirals and generals, they don't understand air power, and they're going to get people killed because this is the new world. And so he was eventually court-martialed. But he had a point. It was the new world. So now Chester Nimitz, after World War I, in the 1920s, as a student in the War College, we're between wars, and at the War College, they start to experiment with this idea, just with a large deck and some toy battleships, this idea of putting aircraft on ships and flying them off to strike the enemy. So literally, by the time World War II starts, we have ships where aircraft can launch. And one of our biggest battles with the Japanese happened 6 months into World War II, the Battle of Midway, carrier against carrier, aircraft against aircraft, and aircraft flying over ships, bombing them and sinking them. The world had come full circle. And so a man who, as an adult, would not have been able to know how to use a zipper because it wasn't invented, becomes one of the greatest leaders in aviation warfare at his peak as an adult. He embraced technology and studied it and learned how to use it. And so by the end of World War II, it's no longer new. We carrier strike groups are a part of who we are, not just as the U.S. Navy, but many navies. Next slide. So really, what was this change about, and what does it mean for cyber today? Well, as a warfighter, I thought about it. What is different about this domain? So when you look back to when Chester Nimitz started, and his colleagues say at West Point, warfighting was sort of one-dimensional. It was just in this plane. You're on the waters, you see another ship, and you're going to be in this domain. If you're on the land, you see other soldiers, and then that's the domain you fight in. Next slide. But when World War I, with the sinking of the Lusitanian, all of a sudden it became clear to all of us there was a second domain, German U-boats, and we would have to be able to fight underneath our feet and out in front of us. And that changed the way we thought as a Navy and the way we fought. Next slide. So now you've got these aviators and the potential of something coming from up above. So for my green friends on the land, now they're in a two-dimensional fight, and the Navy's in a three-dimensional fight. You can have something coming from above, you can have something in the same plane you're in, and you can have something coming from underneath. It's astonishing. In the space of just a few decades, we went from being one-dimensional warfighters to three-dimensional warfighters. The adaptation and what it took for all these sailors and soldiers to be able to do this is pretty astonishing. And then, of course, we add space. Next slide. So what is it about cyber? Well, my contention is that cyber takes us from 3 dimensions of warfighting into the 4th dimension. That it's this concept of the speed of light. So let me take you on this journey. Have any of you ever read the book A Wrinkle in Time as a kid? There's going to be a movie. One person. Would you please stand up? You want to see the excitement of what happens when you break barriers? Watch this. No, yeah. And listen, a lot of you are laughing. Isn't it interesting? Isn't that what cyber does? It connects us and it makes us break barriers. And the change is what makes us afraid. Do you remember what A Wrinkle in Time was about? Oh, can you give us a rough guess?
I bet you can.
Yes. Excuse me, excuse me, excuse me. Speaking to the mic.
I know, I don't remember it well enough to describe the plot. I read this in like 2nd grade.
She read it in 2nd grade and doesn't remember it. Did you get an A on the book report?
Hell yes.
Hell yes. She remembers she got an A. Wrinkle in Time is about time travel.
Yes.
She agrees with that.
Oh,
Thanks for raising your hand. Excuse me. Isn't it frightening when you break barriers? Look at what it does to you. It's like, whoa. She's like, am I going to ask, you going to ask me a question? No.
There was another gentleman there, he's read the book.
Read the book? Who do we got? Oh, he's the moderator. I don't think that's fair. So it is, it's about time travel. And it brings in this idea of, teaches children about this idea of dimensionality. And so, when I get back to that flat level plane, the first plane, we say, look, the shortest distance between 2 points from A to B is a straight line. If you want to get from A to B, just walk straight to that person. A Wrinkle in Time says, no, when you want to time travel, you don't walk from A to B. You bring the 2 points together, and then you just step through. It's a tesseract. I have a lot of people who aren't believing me. It's physics. And you go, okay, that's a good theory, time travel. There's going to be a movie on it later this year. You can go watch yourself. But I want to prove it to you now that it happens to all of us. So 1997, I'm going to Leavenworth, and I'm going to get my master's degree, so I buy my first desktop computer. And some of you might go, that's late, but I got to remind you, I think the World Wide Web was only born in 1994, so that was probably pretty reasonable embracement of technology. And this thing comes in a box with cow markings, so I unload it, and I set it up, and then it doesn't work. But there's a 1-800 number. So I call, I'm in Leavenworth, Kansas, and this helper is in India. And it was so long ago that he told me he actually was in India. And then, I'm just saying. So then, he says, oh, let's fix your computer. And I'm like, yes, let's fix my computer. And he says, may I take control of your computer? I go, what are you talking about? So he's in India and I'm in Kansas, and the next thing I know, my cursor's moving on my computer. And right there in my little office in Kansas, A met B. He moved my cursor from 2 continents away at the speed of light. And I knew I had fallen into the 4th dimension. And every day, we move at the speed of light, and it's become so commonplace we don't even recognize it. But when you think about how we have to operate, we are not only going to have to operate in the physicality of the dimensions that we know, we have to operate at the speed of light with connection. And that is change that is hard on us. Next slide. And so, coming out of World War II, the aircraft got more advanced. That's 1950s, Panther, and then that's the state of computing in the 1950s. Ticker tapes, moving forward from Ed Callahan, computations. And then 1982 was a pivotal year for me because that's when I graduated from Annapolis. And we had moved on to the F-14 Hornet. So air power is still modernizing. And this is the state of computing in 1982. The K-Comp Pro 2 at 29 pounds, kilobytes per minute computation, I think, $1,790-something. I could not afford it as a brand new midshipman. So 1982 is 1905 for Chester Nimitz. It's my zipper is that computer. What the heck is this thing? So why is this so hard? Next slide. I have a friend who's also a boss who says, boy, if you ever want a new idea, read an old book. So Future Shock came out in 1970, and Toffler looks at some studies, and one of them was by the University of Michigan, where they found that if you have too much going on, too much technological change, too much information, your whole thought process breaks down. You just can't deal with it. In fact, most people credit this 1970 book with the creation of the term information overload. 1970. Where do you think we are now in terms of information overload from 1970? And so, as things change, we lose our decision-making capability. We literally just sort of melt down. And so, it wasn't just the K-Comp 2 that, how do I use this thing? Technology started to permeate everything. So when I left for my first ship, it was overseas, 1982, that was the state of banking. And for those of you who are on a different side of the calendar, those are people. And that person behind the desk is a human being who's a teller. And I would go to the bank and I would give them a piece of paper and they would give me my money. And I was happy. And when I came back in 1985, they had taken away that guy behind the desk and they had automated him and created this automated teller machine. And there was no way I was going to stick a plastic card into some machine and trust that my bank account was going to be all right. It was shocking to me. Where's the person? How do I trust this machine? And eventually you do, and eventually it becomes normal. And then most of you in the audience are already laughing at me. They're going, ATM, Admiral, I've got an app for that. What? Who uses an ATM? If you don't adopt and embrace technology, you will be left behind. But more importantly, will you be able to lead? Next slide. And so while I was at Fleet, I realized as a youth-oriented organization, it's pretty easy to get to a point where most of our sailors are under 30. And so someone like me is actually pretty rare. And so something like 85% of my enlisted force are millennials. That means they were born around 1990, about the time and birth of the World Wide Web. And so they've never lived in a time without the zipper. It's always been there. The apps have always been there. And that can make for different changes when you're trying to communicate. And let me just give you an example. I'd like to see a show of hands. How many of you have gaming consoles? Okay, everybody, please keep your hands up. No, please keep your hands up. I won't break the barrier again. You'll be okay. Everybody look around. Why aren't all the hands up? How common are gaming consoles? 60% of the households in the United States have gaming consoles. The average person goes home and spends about 2 hours on the internet, 1.75 hours right now, at the end of their day. And so if you're not gaming, where are you? But you're under 30s gaming. I mean, as you get younger, there's almost all of them are gaming, and it's not gender. It's men and women spending their time on the internet. That's their entertainment. That's where they innovate. That's where they connect. And if you don't understand that as a leader, it's hard to communicate with them, and it's hard to lead them. And then in my case, if I don't understand how it works, what they're doing, how do I lead them and fight? Because we will fight in this domain. If we fight in the physical domain, someday if we have a conflict, we will be fighting in this domain simultaneously at the speed of light. There's no doubt in my mind. And am I the admiral who's going to be Chester Nimitz, who's embraced it and figured out how to operate in this domain and to dominate in this domain? Will I be that person, the admiral who could lead them through it? Next slide. So much has happened. 2012, Saudi Aramco was attacked. 30,000 computers down in a day, the 10th largest supplier within OPEC. And they managed to operate through it. It's astonishing to me. Maliciously taken down to try and hurt the company. And so there's other examples of this, which you all know, everything from Sony to just other malicious breaches, criminal breaches. This domain, we're all in it. And so you have political activity, you have criminal activity, we now have vigilante activity. In 2015, as ISIS was coming to the forefront, different hacktivist groups said, the governments can't deal with this. They got together to figure out and start identifying ISIS members who had Twitter accounts, and then they would turn them over to Facebook or Twitter or other social media saying, we have worked together and we figured out these are the ISIS members. And they were right in about 800 cases and helped the governments shut down people who were creating terrorism, pushing terrorism across the globe. So you have vigilantes, you have criminals, and you have everything else I talked about, innovation. This domain is as real as the air domain, is as real as my maritime domain, is as real as the land domain that we're sitting in. And there's a lot going on. But what we don't have is Billy Mitchell. That's the guy I talked about at the beginning, the one star who said, if we don't understand how this domain works, that it's going to be powerful, we will fail in this domain. And so, obligations of leaders, if there is no Billy Mitchell, then you need to be the Billy Mitchell. You have to understand how to operate, how to embrace new technology, and then you have to lead the way in its employment. And so I'm happy to talk more about these ideas and about cybersecurity, because there's a whole lot of leadership that could be done in cybersecurity or in anything else. So thank you very much for your attention.
Terrific speech.
Thank you.
I read not only Wrinkle in Time, but all the sequels as well.
You're in. Pablo. Hi.
Thank you.
Right.
Thanks.
Thank you all, and thanks to the Admiral for that terrific speech. Craig introduced me. I'm James Kaplan. I'd like to introduce two of our panelists. Rowan Amin, who's the CISO at JP Chase, and Pablo Holman, who is a noted technologist and hacker currently working for Bill Gates and Nathan Myhrvold. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So we'd like to have a bit of a discussion this afternoon about what cybersecurity means for big institutions and important enterprises in an increasingly digital world. What's the intersections? How do we think about cybersecurity strategically? Let me start with Rowan for our first question. Much more financial services is being done online, which makes trust ever more important. What do JP Chase's customers want from the bank from a security standpoint, and how hard is it to give that to them?
Thanks, James. As we've talked about, and that was fantastic, by the way, Admiral, trust these days absolutely is about digital and cybersecurity, and customers expect that in all of the interactions they have with you. They expect that in terms of the products and services that are being made available to them. They expect that in how you innovate and what are the solutions that you're creating and building and providing to them. It's really sort of an expectation now that is part of it. And it's important that the technology and security teams are really focused and working closely with the business at the inception, at the creation of new ideas, new products and services, to make sure that we're thinking about security from the very beginning, not something that we try to bolt on a little bit later, but it's inherent in the design. Customers are absolutely expecting this, especially as everything is becoming more and more digitized.
Are there any differences between consumers and enterprises as customers, or are the expectations the same?
Definitely, it's a little bit different. For example, for our large wholesale clients, we actually sponsor a survey. It's a payment fraud and control survey. And in that survey, over 74% of the respondents actually told us that they've been affected by some form of wholesale fraud, in terms of their fraudulent wholesale payments. And so they were trying to figure out how to make sure that money movement, payment security is assured. How do they think about their interactions from a payment standpoint? On the retail side, on the commercial side, more the B2C thing, it's a little bit different. Recent breaches obviously have changed the way that we can authenticate and provide identity to banks. Some of the ways that we have done identity and access before, using information that is now widely available, we're going to have to change in that realm. So it's a different conversation, a conversation that has evolved, I think, over time. Before, it was something that people didn't necessarily want to talk about. It was a little bit of a scary topic. But now it is very much a driving conversation, something that people want to understand and know about.
Pablo, Rowan said something I think that was very interesting and important about getting business, technology, operations together. How do attackers think about this? How do they think about sort of mining the seams between different parts of an organization in order to exploit a vulnerability?
Yeah, I think attackers are driven, by economic opportunity, right? They're looking for, where can they get an edge, where can they get an advantage, and historically there's been a lot of opportunity. There's a lot of what we call attack surface, right? And that's not just in authentication, but it's in exploiting vulnerabilities in the code that's running, all those kinds of things. And so, the way I think about it is, the attackers are going to go wherever the opportunity is, right? And so the typical case for a bank or a big company running a lot of infrastructure is they've got to make sure that they're just not the low-hanging fruit. We always have had this maxim in computer security, which is that if you're being chased by a bear, you don't have to be able to run faster than the bear. You just have to be able to run faster than your friends. And this is really the way you got to think about it if you're running a big organization is you just want to not be the low-hanging fruit because attackers will go
test
after
that idea. I want to test that idea.
Yeah, okay, good.
Because I've heard many CIOs and CISOs say, gee, on security, we're all on the same side, right? And if we can't just be faster to the next side. There needs to be trust in the environment. Ron, I was wondering, which side of that debate do you come down on? Is it about being faster than the next guy, or does everybody in the ecosystem have to be reasonably good?
Chase is slightly faster than the other guys.
Absolutely. It definitely is about the ecosystem, in my view. And especially, when you start focusing on, in our realm, if you start focusing on some of the business processes that are really systemically important, and you think about wholesale payments as an example, that's not something that a single institution sort of does on their own. It is an ecosystem, and it's really important that we get the ecosystem together to work on that. So I'm a firm believer, if we look at and think about systemic risk, it is important that we have all of the players who are part of that if we're going to improve the
Admiral, is the Navy part of an ecosystem when it comes to cybersecurity?
So we're all part of the same ecosystem. We just don't realize it. So in terms of competition, I sat on a panel one time with a senior Microsoft exec, and he said, hey, in my view, there's two types of organizations in the world, those that have been hacked and those who don't know they've been hacked. Yeah. So if you might think you're faster than the bear, but you've already tripped. For us, one of the things we've learned is it's about the control of information. And information moves very quickly. And so what we learned, it's not just about the professional customer, it's everyone. This is very connected. So in World War II, there was this expression, loose lips sink ships. And then our folks came up with a few years ago, no, loose tweets sink fleets. and what, just saying. What we find is, I can take my sailor and I can train him, and I say you have to be operationally thoughtful. That when you pull into port overseas, do not get on social media. And so we do all this training, and they're our immediate ecosystem. But then if we don't train the families, all that means is the sailor could be thoughtful and do a point-to-point email with the spouse and say, honey, I'm safe, I just pulled into Djibouti. And then if the spouse goes, on social media goes, oh, my husband's safe, he just pulled into Djibouti. Okay. It's too connected. And everybody, the primary customer, the plus, is all out there. And so the training has to be for everyone. And you might think you beat your friends, but in reality, when your friend falls, they end up bringing you down with them.
That must be a monumental culture challenge. You have, as you mentioned, an enlisted force that's younger than 30 on average. Every one of them has, in effect, what's an incredibly sophisticated sensor in his or her pocket. How do you get people to change behavior like that?
So you have to start, we've learned we have to start at the very minute they come into boot camp and start teaching and talking about these things. That we have to make it part of our culture. And so as leaders, we're obligated to talk about it all the time and make sure they're aware of the vulnerabilities. And then we have to create forums where we bring the families in and talk about it. And so that they're aware of how they can support their spouse in being secure as well as keeping their family secure.
Ron, how does JPMC create a culture around security, given that you probably have a similar set of issues, I suppose young bankers as opposed to young sailors, but nonetheless, how do you guys think about that?
So many facets to it. Clearly, education, training are all part of that. Starting early, as the Admiral noted, we actually go into public schools, for example, and we educate students and parents on the importance of this space. But back at the bank, certainly, employing things like gamification. How do we actually get people to treat this as a little bit of create some competitive energy around it? The other thing is really talking more about this as a business enabler as opposed to just a control thing that we have to do. So really, as this conversation has evolved over the past couple of years, turning the conversation into one where security is something that can help the business win. Security is something that clients and customers want. Security is not something scary, but something that we should be talking about, gets more people engaged in that conversation. And then lastly, what I would say is, especially as the business is becoming more digital, you want to be able to create an environment that fosters the innovation, that allows the technology teams who are building to incorporate security as they go through. And to me, that is more about doing things through software, through code, through automation, and less about people reading documentation and trying to figure out what they're supposed to be doing, but to actually make it so that the things you want them to do are inherent in the environment that they're actually creating. So training and awareness is absolutely important, but I believe it has its limitations. And to some degree, you're going to have to figure out how do we actually instrument the environment so they don't have to worry about it.
How important is social engineering?
Well, yeah, right. So one way of thinking about this is that the computers aren't the problem; the people are. If you could just get rid of them,
Yeah.
everything would be totally secure.
Actually, that's really
Just had an ATM.
Yeah.
Took that teller out of it.
Yeah, exactly.
I've heard any number of people say, gee, we can get rid of vulnerabilities. All we have to do is get rid of the computers and go back to legal pads and index cards. This is a very interesting way of looking at it. Keep the computers and get rid of the people.
Yeah, and I think that's really the long-term plan, but on a very long horizon. So you guys are probably all fine. You get to retire and then die, and then we're going to just be done with these humans. Things will be totally secure by then, I'm sure. The thing I think about, like with social engineering, the opportunity is always there to say, to what extent does this person have a capability that I want? And then, can I go get that from them? And if I take over their computer, maybe I can get that. If I take over their mind, maybe I can get that too. And so, I don't think of this as being like super sophisticated type of a tech. It doesn't scale well. One of the problems with people is like you got to go talk each one of them into giving you their password or something. That gets a little old. Attackers are looking for something they can do on a larger scale, and so they'd rather take over your computer than your brain. So, sorry, your brains aren't worth as much as you thought.
Admiral, Ron talked about security as an enabler for the business. Can defensive cybersecurity be a force multiplier for the Navy?
I think certainly defense of your networks is a force multiplier for any organization. So you just talked about it from banking. I mean, if you can't defend your network, stop someone from getting inside, your customers aren't going to feel secure. And so you have to be able to defend your networks. It doesn't matter whether you're in the military or in finance. If you're breached, then you're a vulnerability, not just at that individual unit level, but potentially across the entire Navy or across the entire military.
How do you think about the trade-offs between protection and innovation? Obviously, I'm sure the U.S. Navy is a high-value target, right? How do you think about how much control to put in place, how much to sort of control the flow of innovation versus how much to allow people to innovate, how much to allow people to share innovation? Is that how much of a trade-off is that, and how do you think about the trade-off?
So we have found you can build isolated forums where people can go innovate and share. And then you vet the organizations that go in, and then you share within that secure environment. And so you don't want to constrain innovation. I mean, those are like two opposites in terms of terminology. So then you just have to figure out how to create the forums, whether they're virtual or real, where you can put the people together so that they can get to innovation.
So you can create pockets or secure areas where people feel safe.
Well, where we know they're safe.
And when you know they're safe, and they feel safe, because
Yes.
both things have to be true.
Yes.
To the point about trust. And I suppose that goes to your point about security potentially being a force multiplier.
Yes.
How does the bank think about that? How does the bank think about the trade-off between innovation and security?
This reminds me of a time when I was doing a town hall with employees. And one of the employees came up to me after the event and asked if there was some way we could slow down the innovation because they couldn't keep up. I responded and told them, do you still want a job here?
Yeah.
Because the reality is you must keep up. And really, it's the mindset has to change, especially from a security and technology standpoint. It's about enablement. It's not about no. It's about how. And that is the mantra that we definitely have, that I talk about with my teams. Either the business is going to want to go there. And either you're part of that journey or you will be left behind. And you either do it in a way that is safe and sound, or you're just not going to be part of that conversation. So to me, it is really about, I mean, it's obviously a careful balance. But it is about changing the mindset of how do I make this thing actually work, as opposed to being resistant to it, whether it's blockchain, public cloud, all the things that are changing out there, really getting in front of that and thinking about enablement as the mindset.
Could you speak a little bit more about some of the techniques you use? You mentioned when we were chatting earlier about building security into APIs, so developers and business people could access them seamlessly. Could you talk about some of the techniques like that you use or are using?
Yeah, I mean, more and more, we actually have to think about different notions of who's connecting to us, different definition of who a client is or who a customer is, people who are developers as customers or clients in a sense, who want to interact with our capabilities and our ecosystem, and doing that through technology that has been built correctly once or built correctly strategically, so that they're able to leverage it and not having to worry about the security aspects of it. So we very much think about security as something that you integrate into your development process, something that you implement in code and software, something that is actually scalable for a digital business to keep pace with. Definitely have to get away from a mindset where people have to read policies or documentation and try to figure out what it is you want. You're going to have to actually implement it in a way that can move quickly at the pace that they really want to go after.
Elvis, what do you think?
Well, all the computers from ancient history that were shown on the screen before came with like a shelf of manuals, which that's what I grew up reading, sadly, to explain how they work. And it's written for engineers. Do you remember the manual that came with your iPhone? We got rid of that because nobody was going to read them and much less understand them and put that stuff into practice. And so, we had to figure out how to make technology work like humans instead of making humans work the way our computers did. And I think that's really the job of a bank these days. I mean, if you look historically, the whole point of a bank is to secure some of your stuff for you. And then there's that one point of contact where you're supposed to be able to tell the bank what you want them to do with your stuff or your money or whatever it is. And that's really the point we're at still today, except that we're using computers to do it. And so the job for a bank is how are you going to make it easy and secure and reliable and trustworthy and all those things for the customer without them having to read a bunch of manuals or policy documents or technical stuff or, try to become an expert on parsing the headers on an email to figure out if it went through some proxy mail server or something. That's the job. And that's the job a bank can't get out of. If they get out of that job, there's no job left for them. So
what's it take to create a digital experience for a digital experience for customers that's both compelling and secure?
It really starts with simplification. You really have to, and there's a lot of complexity that we have ourselves to blame over time that we have created with all of the control environment and things that we've built. And clearly, those are very important. But how do we actually simplify those things? Again, focus on automation, self-service, give the consumers and clients choice and control. And that really is, those tenets are really sort of inherent in having a business that's a digital business but enabled by security as opposed to being held back. Simplification is really, you got to break the problem down and really focus on the customer-client experience from the very beginning.
How important is simplification to security? We're dealing with worlds of increasingly complex networks, right? Is there some incredible tension between increasing complexity and the desire and the need to be secure? Do we need to simplify some of these networks in order to achieve security?
Well, we we have to back the whole design piece up. And you talked about all the manuals. You know, when electricity was invented, you know, what did we want people to be able to do? Did we want them to understand how to run the electrical power plant, or did we just want them to be able to flip a switch? And what is it they need to be able to do to receive electricity? And if they have to understand how to run the power plant,
Yeah.
they'll stick with coal fires.
Right, yeah.
And so the same issue, whether you're talking about the creation, the human interface creation in software or systems, we've figured out you have to back it way up.
Right.
What is it we want the sailor to do? And do we want the sailor to be, every sailor to be at the a hacker level? Or do we just want them to be able to sit and do their day-to-day job, and then something is pushed to them, and then they just can say yes or no and continue on with whatever their primary work is? So we realized we not only have to back it up in terms of in our acquisition process and start thinking about software and how it interfaces with our sailors, but we also have to start thinking it in the hardware as well, in terms of the security chain. How do you think about where you're getting all these subcomponents from, and which ones need to be completely secured, and work our way through that thought process and build that into how we acquire and build systems.
One thing I'm hearing, I think, from all three of you is the importance of design and design thinking to security, being quite thoughtful about design. Is that right? Is that critical?
No.
No?
Because that means
ask
you
a
have,
silly question.
Because it means that you have to be smarter than all the attackers. It means that you have to anticipate everything they're going to do and stop it before you deploy anything. And that's impossible. We've never succeeded at that. The attackers always have more time and attention and to waste on messing with your stuff than you do. So you're not going to win. And I think that really means you have to change your perspective from this notion of security in almost every environment. You could try. You're not going to make things totally secure. It's not a security problem, though. It's a risk management problem. You should assume that you've been compromised and act accordingly. And if you set yourself up to manage the risk and manage the scenario where things go wrong, then you'll be vastly more resilient and in a much better position than if you try to architect to make things totally secure. I don't think that's possible. I don't have any evidence of that. I've never seen it. And if I haven't, you probably won't. So.
Okay, we have just a couple of minutes left.
I think it's an important point, which is that prevention will fail, and it is also why there's an increasing conversation about resilience and recovery, assuming you're going to have a problem, and how do institutions really think about their ability to recover and get back online. Everything from the business process to the technology environment, and assuming you're going to have a problem and really thinking about resiliency end to end. Your failover environment may not be there. And how do you restore from bare metal in a sense?
So we have just a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to ask that our panelists wrap up. One question I want to hear about, just a few, just a few seconds from each of you. Pavlos, most important advice for big institutions on cybersecurity as we get into an increasingly digital world?
Well, I think in the presentation she showed, the 1D, 2D, 3D, 4D thing, I thought that was a great analogy. The way I think about it, look, if you were any country in the world besides the United States, would you rather control our land or our computers? We're set up pretty well to defend the land. I don't think anybody's going to come for it. The economic value is in the computers. It's in the corporations that run them. That's the target of choice. That's the new frontier. And that's what I want to control. So I think that, it's really important to understand the scope of where we're at, and we're in a new world where that's what matters. So that's a battlefield of the future, I'm sure.
Ron, biggest piece of advice or most important piece of advice?
Actually, to build on what I said earlier, which was to really think about shifting your investment from not just preventative focus, but to also think about things like exercises, regular exercising of your team, your processes, to make sure you know how to handle things like you have a stricken bank in your payment flow, and how are you going to disconnect yourself, and how are you going to reconnect, and do you have a circuit breaker to be able to cut yourself off from the market if you need to. Really testing those things out, understanding who's going to make decisions and when. I I think preparing for the eventuality is really important. And so sometimes we find that organizations have exclusively focused on preventative controls, but this whole notion of dealing with exercises, response, resiliency, getting used to it and getting comfortable with what you're going to have to deal with when it comes at you, I think is really is critically important.
Admiral.
So we talked a lot about this, and it's interesting. It often ends up being, the people versus the machine. Pablo projects a future where the machine will win. So what I think many experts have found, it needs to be the people with the machine.
Yeah.
That if we're going to fight machines or we're going to fight people, people working with machines is how you're successful, whether it's cybersecurity or operations or financial integrity.
Terrific. Thank you. Let's have a hand for our terrific panelists.
Thank you.